The day my father died, the sun was out, bright and gold, the kind of light that makes the dust in the air shimmer like something beautiful. I remember because I was 10, and the morning felt ordinary. My mother made eggs, my father left the house in his faded blue work shirt, same one he wore for 12 years at Corbin Machinery. He didn't come back. They said he stole from the company, that the books didn't match, that parts went missing, expensive ones. They said the cameras caught him loading crates after hours, but my father never worked alone, and the cameras didn't show his face. Just a man in his size and shape. That was enough for the bosses. They didn't press charges. They didn't want publicity. They said he could resign quietly, that the investigation would stay internal, that they'd let him keep his pension if he kept quiet. But everyone knew. And in a town like Rivershed, that meant more than jail time. They called him a thief in the grocery store. They stopped answering his calls. Church families stopped inviting us over. My school friends stopped coming by. He went from respected foreman to pariah in a week. And then, on the third day, he went out to the shed behind our house. My mother found him swinging from the rafters, belt tight around his neck, eyes bulged and lips cracked open in a final gasp that never came. The rope left a red line across his throat like a second smile. But the worst part wasn't his body. The worst part was the laugh. Our neighbor Brent Hale, one of his supervisors at Corbin, stood by the fence with two other men, drinking beer and smiling while the sirens screamed down the block. One of them said something about "saves the court time," and then they laughed. My mother screamed at them through tears, told them they were monsters. But the police didn't hear. They were too busy cutting my father down. That image never left me. My name is Nolan Greaves, and I spent the next 12 years remembering every face that laughed that day. Brent Hale, James Cutter, Richard Knox. 3 men who rose even higher after my father's death. Cutter became regional manager. Knox bought a boat and moved into a lake house. Brent opened his own contracting firm and was hailed as a self-made man on the front page of the local paper. I stayed quiet. I watched. I studied. I learned how the world worked, how people moved, how power protected itself. I learned how companies launder guilt through bureaucracy and how men like Brent manipulate perception. I learned how to disappear in plain sight. And I waited. I'd put myself through school with grants and quiet scholarships, took criminology, forensics, behavioral science. People asked why. I told them I wanted to work in law enforcement. It was a lie, but a useful one. I didn't want justice. I wanted knowledge. Because I wasn't going to make them pay in court. I was going to dismantle them in the dark, piece by piece, until nothing of the men they used to be remained. It started with Cutter. He lived in a sleek condo above the marina, all glass and steel and fake smiles. He held company parties in his penthouse and pretended to be humble. I got a job at one of his favorite restaurants, worked the valet, memorized his schedule. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? He hadn't looked at me twice, even when my father was accused. Just nodded and said, "Unfortunate situation." That's what he always called it. An unfortunate situation. I made sure his brick bob became worse. The first time was subtle. I moved his car across the street during his meal, left the keys in the ignition and a folder in the back seat. Inside were fake invoices, emails, bank logs suggesting he'd embezzled from the company. I sent an anonymous tip to corporate. They put him on leave. He fought back, claimed it was fake. They investigated, couldn't prove anything. But the damage stuck. Whispers, rumors, promotions halted, invitations rescinded, friends stopped calling. The second time I sent photos to his wife. Him and the assistant he didn't think anyone noticed. I followed them to a hotel, got the shots, sent them by mail, no return address. His divorce was finalized 6 months later. No kids, no house. Just a shrinking bank account and a quiet departure from the company he helped run. I saw him last week, waiting at the bus stop with a duffel bag and a drink tucked under his coat. He looked smaller, softer, like the world had forgotten him. Then I moved on to Knox. He was smarter, more careful, but everyone has weak spots. His was pride. He hosted poker nights with investors. I posed as a vendor rep, showed up with the right bottle of bourbon and a story about mutual friends. He didn't remember me either. I wore glasses now, grew a beard, changed my voice. He invited me back. Over the next few months, I learned his patterns, his moods, his tales. Then I let him win. Let him trust me. And when the time came, I let him borrow money. Cash. Big bills. He didn't pay it back. So I called his wife, told her about the late nights, the missing cash. I mailed her footage of him pawing at a waitress behind the club. Then I mailed him copies of everything I sent her. He tried to confront me at the bar, called me a rat, said he'd ruin me. I laughed in his face. Not a loud laugh, not a cruel one. Just a quiet echo of what I'd heard the day my father's body swung in the shed. And that was when he saw it. Beneath the thick layers of ice, recognition hit him like a slap. He turned pale. "You're that kid," he whispered. I said nothing. He stormed out. 1 week later, he sold the lake house. 2 weeks after that, he checked into rehab. The newspapers never said why. And then there was Brent, the man with the beer, the man who laughed the loudest. Brent was different. His business thrived. He had 2 kids, a wife who taught art, and a reputation for charity work. Everyone in town thought he was a hero, built homes for veterans, sponsored youth baseball. But behind the smile, he was still the man who watched my father hang and felt nothing. He would be last. Not because he was the worst, but because I wanted him to feel every step of the fall. And I was going to make it last. Brent Hale lived in a beige brick house at the top of Larchwood Hill. White columns, perfect lawn, the kind of place that looks safe, normal, suburban. He had a security system, cameras, motion lights. He coached his son's basketball team and volunteered every second Saturday at the food pantry. But I knew who he really was. I didn't want to break him like the others, not quickly, not all at once. Brent needed to rot slowly, from the inside out. I wanted his smile to crack piece by piece. I wanted him to start questioning every sound in his house, every shadow behind him. I started with his dog, a golden retriever named Scout, loyal, well-trained. Brent took him jogging every morning, same path, same hour. One night I followed the trail and buried a recording near the park bench. Dogs howling, faint screams, a sharp metallic clatter, subtle, distant. The next morning, Scout froze on the trail. Ears perked, tail stiff, refused to move. Brent looked confused, then angry, then nervous. 2 days later, the audio was louder. Scout started barking at the woods. Brent cut the jog short. By the 3rd week, Scout refused to leave the house. I watched from a distance. Brent tried tugging, yelling. Nothing worked. Scout trembled at the door, tail tucked. Brent gave up, started jogging alone. The next time he went out, I left a note under his windshield wiper at the park. How does it feel when something loyal stops trusting you? No name, no fingerprint, no cameras nearby. That night, I stood outside his house and watched the lights go on and off. Pacing. Panic. He kept looking out the window. I wasn't done. A week later, I mailed him a box. Inside were photos, black and white, low resolution, grainy, but they were of him, standing by the fence the day my father died, laughing, holding a beer. I'd had them printed at a self-service kiosk, no trace. On the back of the top photo, I wrote one line. I remember. He filed a report, claimed he was being harassed. The cops asked if he had any enemies. He said no. They told him they'd look into it. They didn't. For the next month, I faked a fire inspection notice, dropped it on his doorstep. Then 2 weeks later, a fake water shutoff warning. Small disruptions, annoying, unsettling. Then his tires were slashed. Just one each time, not enough to alert the police seriously, enough to make him doubt everyone. He started installing more cameras. Didn't matter. I was always outside their frame. I watched him spiral in silence. His wife began sleeping in the guest room. His son asked why Dad was so angry all the time. Brent started showing up late to work, snapping at employees, shouting over nothing. But he wasn't even close to where I wanted him. So I gave him a taste. I broke into the shed in his backyard. Quiet. No damage. Just a small, simple change. I hung a belt from one of the rafters. Just like my father's. When Brent found it, he called the police again. They searched, found no prints, no signs of forced entry. He lost sleep, grew pale, started locking himself in the bedroom at night with a baseball bat. Then I made it worse. I mailed him a news clipping, the headline from my father's obituary. No note this time, just that. And a week later, another note. You should have stopped them. That's when he snapped. He took time off from his business, said he needed a mental health reset. The town sympathized, called him brave, but inside, he was rotting. Every sound made him flinch. He stopped going to the pantry, stopped coaching. He told his wife he thought someone was after him. She said he was being paranoid. She left 2 weeks later with the kids. That should have been the end. But Brent wasn't broken yet. Not enough. Because he still hadn't confessed. And I needed him to choke on the truth the way my father had choked on that belt. So I gave him one last push. I called him. Just once. Disguised voice. No number. Didn't say my name, I just whispered 2 words. Your turn. Then I hung up. That night, Brent drove to the river. He parked at the edge of the old bridge. And he sat there for hours, engine running, until a patrol car drove by and made him leave. He went home. But he never left the house after that. He was afraid to. And now I was ready. Because the final act wasn't about fear. It was about truth. Public, raw, undeniable. It was time for everyone to know what he had done. Brent still left the porch light on every night, even though no one came to visit. The driveway was cracked now. Weeds had crept through the edges of the lawn. A man who once had his hands in every corner of town now lived like a ghost, afraid of the sun. But I didn't want his shame to stay private. Not tucked behind blinds and silence. I wanted every whisper in town to wrap around his neck, like that belt did to my father. I wanted the people who once shook his hand to pull theirs back. It began with the ledger. A real one this time. A thick black book, bound in leather, the kind Brent used to log inventory back at Corbin Machinery. I forged entries from 12 years ago. Detailed. Accurate. I spent weeks tracking down old payroll records, employee logs, supply orders. I wrote out the supposed thefts, but I named the real culprits. Brent, Cutter, Knox, dates, times, witness names. I slipped it into a cardboard box along with old company files. Real ones, pilfered from archives by a janitor who still hated the place and remembered my father's name. I printed out photos of Brent's bank deposits from that year. Highlighted amounts. Anonymously bought copies of those black and white photos again. Brent laughing behind the fence. All of it went in the box. I addressed it to the Rivershed Gazette. I knew they wouldn't print it without checking, but I also knew their new editor hated the old Corbin executives. Her father had been laid off with no severance right before Cutter's promotion. She would sniff blood in that box. The article dropped 2 weeks later. Front page, headline in bold. Inside the cover-up, Corbin Machinery's dirty ledgers. It didn't accuse Brent outright, but it hinted, strongly. It questioned why 3 executives were never investigated when the evidence, now conveniently unearthed, showed discrepancies that only someone in management could have manipulated. It named my father, mentioned his death. It printed those photos. It printed parts of the forged log, quotes from anonymous sources, questions from former employees who were never interviewed during the internal probe. But it didn't tell the whole story. But it told just enough. The fallout was fast. Reporters camped on Brent's lawn. Former clients pulled out of contracts. The mayor, once photographed shaking Brent's hand, released a lukewarm statement about ethics and transparency. His business partners distanced themselves. His church asked him not to attend until things settled. And for the first time in years, people said my father's name without sneering. Brent tried to deny it all, tried to claim it was fake. But the problem with fear is that once it's deep enough, you start to lose your grip on your lies. And Brent wasn't holding on anymore, not even to himself. I saw him in the grocery store parking lot one morning, stumbling, shirt wrinkled, eyes red. He didn't see me. He was yelling at no one, just shouting into the air, accusing the people staring at him of believing fake garbage. Then he grabbed a man by the collar and accused him of mailing the photos. He was arrested, released on bail. But the damage stuck. He went home and pulled the belt from the shed again. This time the cops showed up first. Someone had tipped them off. Not me. I hadn't called anyone. But someone in town had seen the signs. Or maybe just didn't want another death on their conscience. They kept him for a 72-hour psych hold. When he came out, his house was egged. Twice. A group of high schoolers put up signs on his lawn, "Thief in red paint." His mailbox was knocked down. Someone carved a rope into the hood of his truck. I watched it all. It didn't stop it. He had lost everything. But it still wasn't enough. Because Brent hadn't admitted it. Not to me, not to the town, not to the ghost of my father. So I arranged one last meeting. A final confrontation. He thought it was another reporter. I sent a letter, signed with the initials JG, the name of the journalist who wrote the Gazette piece. I told him there was a recording, that the source wanted to meet in person, that it would be his chance to clear the air. He came to the location I listed, the old Corbin Machinery warehouse, now condemned, dust-covered, abandoned since the company relocated to a different state. A place that still reeked of oil and rust and silence. I waited inside. When he walked in, I could smell the sweat before he saw me. He looked thinner, face sunken, hands shaking. "I don't have anything to say," he said. "Yes, you do," I said. "You just haven't said it to the right person." His eyes narrowed. It took him a second. Then he saw it. My face. My voice. My name behind my eyes. "Nolan," he said. "Jesus Christ." I didn't move. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," he said. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." I stared. "You framed him," I said. "No, Cutter did. Or Knox. I didn't know what they were doing." "You watched," I said. He didn't answer. "You laughed." That hit him. He blinked fast. His lip trembled. "I was drunk," he said. "We were drunk. We didn't think he'd do it. We thought he'd leave town, start over." "But he didn't," I said. "He hung himself in a shed while you sipped beer and laughed behind a fence." He dropped into a rusted chair, covered his face with his hands. "I didn't kill him," he whispered. "You didn't stop it either." Silence. Then, finally, after all these years, he spoke the truth. "I was a coward," he said. "I knew what they did. I let it happen. I laughed, because I didn't want to be the one who took the fall next. I thought if I just played along, I'd be safe." "And were you?" I asked. He looked up at me. "No," he said, "I wasn't." I left him there. Didn't say another word. Because that was all I needed. Not an apology. Not forgiveness. Just the sound of his voice, cracking under the weight of what he'd done. But there was one last thing I had to do. Something only I could give back. And that was my father's name. The last thing I owed him was truth. Not revenge. Not even the hollow feeling that came after. Just his name cleared. My father, Wesley Greaves, was many things. A father, a husband, a man who worked 12-hour days without complaint. But to the world, for over a decade, he'd been a thief, a quiet disgrace, a man whose death was talked about in hushed tones, framed as guilt with a rope around his neck, and was going to take that narrative back. I started with the Gazette. The editor already suspected the truth ran deeper than her article printed. She was cautious, but when I met with her in person and told her who I was, when I gave her my name and my father's, she didn't ask me to leave. She asked questions. I didn't tell her about the ledger, not the fake one, but I gave her what was real. Emails, statements, gaps in the Corbin records I'd found through months of digging, testimonies from 2 retired employees, both of whom remembered seeing Cutter and Knox in the warehouse late at night. I even had an old memo signed by Brent, backdating inventory logs. Not conclusive on its own, but damning when placed beside the rest. Most importantly, I gave her what Brent had said to me in that warehouse. Not recorded, not written, but detailed, vivid. His words, remembered exactly. She hesitated at first, but I could see it in her eyes. The story mattered more than the risk. For her, it wasn't about vengeance. It was about setting a record straight in a town that never wanted to look back. The new piece was printed 3 weeks later. They framed a good man, the real story of Wesley Greaves. This time, it didn't hide behind implication. It told the story from the beginning. My father's reputation, the so-called evidence, the sudden accusations, the men who benefited from it. My father's death, and how every man who laughed that day fell into ruin. The article didn't call me a vigilante. It didn't call what I did justice. It called it grief with purpose. My mother cried when she read it. She hadn't known everything. I'd kept the worst from her. The notes, the schemes, the way I had haunted Brent until he was a shell. But when she saw my father's name printed next to the word honest, I saw something rise in her that had been dead for years. She smiled, and in that moment, it was worth it. Brent left Rivershed. No ceremony, no goodbye. He sold the house at a loss and moved to a small town no one could pronounce. His business folded a month later. The Gazette printed a small follow-up, local contractor relocates amid scrutiny. They didn't bother quoting him. Cutter was still gone, broke, quiet, forgotten. Knox never returned from rehab. Rumor was he lived in a facility now, somewhere near Denver, private, expensive, the kind you don't leave unless you have someone to come home to. They didn't, and I didn't feel bad for them. They had watched a man lose everything. They had let his son grow up under the shadow of their lie. They had made my father into a warning, a whisper, a joke. But now people remembered him differently. People who used to avoid us now stopped my mother in the store. Teachers who once cut corners with my grades told their students the full story of what happened. My father's grave, once ignored, now held fresh flowers every week, some from me, some from others. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man wronged, a man remembered. A year later, I stood in the same backyard where it had all started. The shed had been cleaned out, long ago, repainted. The beam where he'd tied the belt still stood, but I never replaced it. I left it bare, honest. It wasn't a place of death anymore. It was a place of truth. I didn't hear laughter when I stood there now. Just wind, leaves, distant sounds of a town moving on. I thought about what he would say if he could see me now, what he'd think about what I'd done. The lies I'd told, the darkness I'd lived in for years. But then I remembered something else. The last thing he ever said to me that morning before he left for work. Be better than them, Nolan? I wasn't. But I was done. I didn't need to be better anymore. I just needed to remember and make sure no one ever forgot.